Today we tend to think of farmers as being hyper-conservative, but in the early 20th century, farmers were the leaders of radical change. In Russia, the serfs rose up and deposed Tsar Nicholas II. It was the farmers, not the middle class, that brought communism to Russia. And so a less radical movement formed in Canada called the United Farmers. The United Farmers movement was led by a man named Henry Wise Wood. Wood had grown up in Missouri during the late 19th century populist farmer movements. He knew them to be a wildly imaginative people. In 1905, he bought a wheat farm in Alberta. You have a re-emergence of this kind of behavior with people purchasing a few acres of land to create small organic farms today. He joined a local communist organization called the Society for Equity. During this time, there were dozens of these sorts of small communist leagues, most of which were farm-based. For the most part, people would just sit around, have a few drinks, and talk about the body politique. It was something to distract the many farmers from the toils of their labors. When World War I broke out, these small organizations came together to form the United Farmers of Alberta. Although a war was going on, many of them felt they needed a voice in Ottawa, a lobby. Wood was one of the founding members of the organization, and by 1916, he became president of the organization. Similar movements in BC, Manitoba, and Ontario formed. Most of these were swallowed into other parties. Wood didn't believe the party should enter politics proper. He felt that his particular ideology clashed with many members, and that simply a loose coalition of farmer lobbying was in their best interest. Many were discontented with Wood and sought to be elected. They joined a new party, carefully referred to as the Non-Partisan League. After this, Wood feared losing more members to this new organization and ran a slate of candidates in the local Alberta election. The first few elections saw no successes. After the first MLA was elected in 1921 by-election, they decided to run a full slate of candidates for the next election. The UFA shocked everyone by actually winning the whole damn thing. The UFA had knocked the Liberal Party out of power after over a decade in power. To this day, the Liberals have not won an election in Alberta, almost 100 years later. The UFA really had no idea how to run a government, though. They didn't even have a proper leader. They asked the former Liberal Premier to stay on as leader and join the farmers. He refused. Henry Wood also had no interest in being Premier. Herbert Greenfield took the job for the sake that nobody else wanted it. Greenfield was a former Liberal who had made his way through various agricultural organizations and held various leadership positions. But never once did he actually have to run anything. Here was the challenge. The UFA did not believe in partisanship. They believed in 100% open vote, like the US Senate had. Because of this, the leaders were unable to whip the vote on any particular decisions. This made passing legislation extremely difficult, and causing him to constantly have to negotiate with his own party. His one success was creating the Alberta Wheat Pool. This was a cooperative-based pricing scheme that would allow farmers to sell their wheat at a better rate than normal. It would also allow for collective negotiations with sellers, and most importantly, with government. The Canadian government, in fear of the growing power of the wheat pool, created the Canadian Wheat Board to directly compete with it. Eventually they killed off the wheat pool, and in the Wheat Board, a monopoly. Years of drought struck Alberta, and simultaneously the price of grain dropped. With less money coming in, Greenfield was forced to make cuts to the service. By this point, his own party wanted him gone. On the federal front, the party began running candidates for election. Initially, they received a small share of the vote. They peaked in 1930 when they captured 10 MPs total, a very high amount for an Alberta fringe party. Greenfield and Wood were both gone by 1930. Replacing Wood was Robert Gardner. If Wood was a moderate communist, Gardner was full-fledged. If Gardner was a fire, the new premier replacing Greenfield was the ice. John Edward Brownlee was a lawyer by trade who spent a large amount of his time lobbying and working for farmers. When he asked to replace Greenfield, it was with relative ease, Brownlee was the Attorney General previously, and in the UFA government, the Attorney General was essentially the person making all of the decisions. Now with full power, Brownlee opted for an orthodox manner of managing political economy. His biggest victory was in winning resource rights from Ottawa. This allowed him to manage the resources of the province and earn revenues from them. This major victory allowed him to pass balanced budget after balanced budget. His style was simply to cut loose any crown corporations that weren't earning and create new ones in industries that were doing well. Nothing was sacred. This all came to an end when the Great Depression hit in the 30s. His budgets began running deficits, and the party had no plan to bail out those suffering from global economic collapse. In Alberta, this would lead to the rise of the Socreds. Federally, their fortunes were mixed. Although still represented, they were now part of a coalition of interprovincial farmers called the Progressives. The Progressives were only successful in ever getting third place. At some point, they were able to hold the balance of power, but never were they ever able to create positive changes for farmers. At the outset of World War II, the UFA formally dissolved their lobbying wing. Mackenzie King had offered to make a deal in which they would get paid a low price for wheat now, and in the future would be given a very high government price. With patriotism running high, there was simply nothing to lobby for. The remaining UFA MPs would join up with the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, or the modern-day New Democratic Party. UFA as an organization still maintains a large number of farmer assets. With 1,300 employees, 120,000 members, they operate gas stations, farms, supply stores, equipment shops, lumber yards, sports stores, and a small construction company.